Hey, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Cool Sports Network. I am your host, Chase Coburn, and today I am joined by a very special guest, a college athletics writer for Front Office Sports, Amanda Christovich. Amanda, thanks so much for coming on. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's amazing to be able to speak with you. Obviously, so many controversial, but also great topics to talk about in the world of college athletics. So I can't wait to jump into that. Let's first learn about you. When did you realize you wanted to be a sports writer, kind of go down this path for your career? And what has been your career path since to get to the point where you're at now?
Let's see. Honestly, ever since I started thinking of realistic, I guess, options for me to be in my career, I've been interested in sports writing. I played baseball growing up and always loved sports, and I sort of in school wrote a lot, and of course it was like creative writing in the beginning, and then I kind of learned about journalism and was like, okay, this seems interesting. And in high school, like at the end of high school and then the beginning of college, I tried it out a little bit and was like, oh wow, I really do love this. And so I just spent most of college. I didn't study journalism, but I spent most of college pursuing every single sports media, journalism, social media, broadcast internship that I could find.
Right.
And but I really honestly at my core always wanted to be a writer. I always I'm oh, I hate being on camera. I just want to write. Um and so then I moved to New York, went to grad school for journalism to kind of get some of the hard skills, and got this job at Front Office Sports in the middle of the pandemic when they were one of the only companies hiring. And yeah, I've been there ever since.
Yes, you have, and you've been able to write so much great content for that. We're actually going to talk about some of your most recent articles, and I'm going to want you to kind of go more in depth or explain to the audience more about that. But before we really do get into that, let's talk about some of the roles you had before. I know you were an intern for the Wall Street Journal before you landed at Front Office Sports. What did you learn there? And also when you worked with USA Today with Rockets Wire, how did that really help you improve your craft and your overall ability as a writer before getting this job?
Yeah, those were my two big internships in writing, right? And I was very fortunate to get them. USA Today, my summer internship that sort of I parlayed into writing about the Rockets, which I'm not really an NBA person, didn't know anything about the Rockets. I'm from LA, live in New York now, went to school in DC. It was a very funny, interesting kind of
Big
role.
cities,
But
yeah.
I learned a lot. Yeah, it was cool. I just didn't have any ties to the Rockets, right?
Yeah.
So, I think at those two places, I just really learned about writing about sports from a national perspective, right? I wasn't covering a team. I wasn't writing about, I'm a huge New York Yankees fan. I'm not sure when this pod is dropping, but World Series game 1 is tonight. I'm really excited. But I'm not writing about the Yankees,
Yeah.
right? I was writing about um, you know, head injuries in sports. I was writing about the cross between politics and sports. I was, doing profiles on broadcasters. And then at the Wall Street Journal, it was even more of that, very enterprise, write features about the business of, the social media scene, which to you is probably you're why is that even a story? And that's what I thought too, because I was oh, everyone knows about these eighth grade social media stars, and this was pre NIL era, right?
Yeah.
And my editor was no, they don't, especially the readership at the Wall Street Journal, which is not exactly the under 25 market for the most part. They don't know about this, so write a feature on it. And I really learned to look at sports coverage from a much sort of broader lens. And then in turn, I realized I really liked that and thought it was way more fun, frankly, than covering the games to me. I love sports. I love the games. But honestly, from a career perspective, I found that it was more intellectually stimulating to be writing about sort of the off-field things.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up because I think it's so easy. Obviously, the some of the best writers out there are a lot of the ones who could cover, a lot of specific stories, give their predictions on the NFL or the NBA. But whenever I do these interviews, I always try to get a better perspective of who they are as writers and take it or whatever industry they are in this kind of broad topic, and then
Mhm.
also try to look at how can I be unique because theoretically anyone could talk sports. I can get an 8-year-old on here who could be knowledgeable and probably talk sports, but I think it's finding that unique story or that unique balance you kind of want to have, and I think that's very interesting, and that's why I'm so happy to have you on because I think you've really found that, and a lot of your work with front office sports does show that. Explain to the audience kind of what a day to day life is of being a writer for front office sports and kind of all your priorities on a day to day basis.
Yeah, I mean, it changes every day. So like I have an office that we go to a few days a week in New York City, which is really great because as reporters, like you don't always have an office to go to. You're on the road,
Yeah,
you're meeting sources, so like when I don't have those things, like it's nice to like have somewhere to go and like be out in the world. But I'm in my small apartment in New York City today. I would say my day to day is like a combination of being on the phone with as many people as I can, texting, emailing, calling, bothering sources, having them bother me, um, trying to figure out either chasing the latest story, see if there's some sort of mini scoop I can get, working on a feature, working on an investigative piece, that sort of thing. I also do some multimedia, like we have a YouTube show and a podcast, so I go on that. I'll do radio, TV hits to talk about my work. And then the rest of it is like spent writing and editing. And I have a really great editor who spends a lot of time like with me making um, what I write actually sound good and like get into the mechanics of writing, which I feel like often gets lost in journalism because it's like we just got to get the information out but ultimately like people don't have attention spans. So you have to like write in
yeah.
a way that's going to keep them reading. That's going to be good. Like the writing needs to be good, right? So I think that's like I would say just like a normal day to day. Obviously, if I'm traveling, I'll travel for not as much as other sports writers who like go every weekend to a different game, but I'll go to like Final Four. I'll go to, like if there's a trial that I'm covering, I'll go to cover the trial. Events like that, features. Like
Yeah.
you know, I spent 30 minutes before I got on the phone with you trying to figure out how to get to Penn State next weekend. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to go because getting to Penn State from New York City is not as easy as I thought, but it's just like, it's the
Yeah.
life of a sports writer.
Yeah, you do have to kind of compromise in a sense, but you did mention trying to like hook your reader and trying to make sure that your writing makes them want to keep going. And I think part of that, just to make them click on it in the first place, is the title. Now, I don't know how much you work with that and like SEO and all that types of things to try to get a reader to click on the article, but I don't really know what your involvement is there. But how important is it? Obviously, I'm sure you could tell to have a really hooky like title. It's something I like about front office sports. You got to have bullet points at the beginning of each article, kind of explaining what it's going to be about. How do those quick points at the beginning help you kind of transition into your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I have more involvement with headlines than a lot of writers do, especially like at newspapers. Writers like don't have any say and they don't even know what the headline is until it comes out the next day. And I'm sure you've heard stories of like writers who like go into the locker room next day and like the coach or the players like really upset about a headline and they're like, I didn't write it. Like I didn't even know. Like, it was the editor writes the headlines. Um I definitely have a say. I do headline workshops like on pretty I suggest something for every story. And I think that's like a function of like I work at a startup, so like everyone kind of has to help with everything. I mean, look, it's the most important thing, right? Because nobody, you're fighting for everyone's time and attention. And there are so many types of stories in sports, like game stories, for example, that people used to read because they didn't have access to that information anywhere else. Now you can just like go on Twitter and like watch, the highlights or the replays or see the memes, right? Like you don't even need to read about the game.
Yeah.
You don't have to ever click an article to know what happened. So you have to figure out what kind of stories people aren't going to get through any other medium. and then you have to portray that in a headline. So it's not
Right.
easy, and it's like very hit or miss. Um, a lot of the times the stories that like get the most clicks, I like never in a million years would have expected them to. And then like other stories that I work really hard on like don't get as many, and then I get very sad.
Yeah.
um,
That's just
but
sports writing, though. It's kind of an
yeah,
element of luck in a sense, too.
I mean, look, it's a business. Like journalism is a business, just like anything else. And we all have our morals and our ethics about not letting, clicks and the business like influence what we do. But like we don't have a choice, right?
Mhm.
So essentially what you're trying to battle, the push and pull is always like, how do you do enough of the stories that keep the lights on? And that hopefully you do with integrity. Hopefully they're interesting so that you have time to do those other stories that, may or may not hit, but that are important, interesting, or fun.
Yeah. We're gonna break down some of those stories, specifically one that I'm really interested to hear more of your thoughts on. But you mentioned how you kind of go to the biggest events, some of those trials. You've also gone to like Final Fours. Obviously, you've covered March Madness as a collegiate athletics writer. The tournament is largely considered one of the best, most exciting in all of sports. It's my favorite tournament. I'm a UConn Huskies fan, so it's been a lot of fun over the past few years. But
Easy,
from
easy
from a
money for you.
it has been, yeah. It was bad when I was first born in a sense, actually when I was first born, that was the
True.
Walker era. But like for a while, they had that really rough time. But obviously now they're back. Dan Hurley's doing a great job with that program. From a reporter's view, how great is March Madness, and how does it elevate itself from other tournaments?
Yeah, I mean, it's my favorite thing to cover. I say it's like my Super Bowl. Like the way that the cadence of my job is like when the Super Bowl ends, because like a lot of my coworkers, they'll go to the Super Bowl and like they're literally like working, days, weeks, like nonstop, losing their minds. Super Bowl ends, like they come back, they take a breather. That's when I step in, right? Because it's like Super Bowl to, you know, championship weekend in April is my crazy time. And I cover the men's and women's tournaments. Um, I started my job in 2020, so like I've been doing it for, the last 4 years, but obviously in the last couple of years the women's tournament has, garnered just as many if not more eyeballs as the men's. So I go back and forth like 2 years ago I went to the women's final four, last year I went to the men's. I'll probably go back to the women's this year. Um but it's, what makes it great is the thing that actually college football is trying to get back, which is parity. What makes it
Mhm.
great is these tiny little schools, these crazy stories, these ridiculous fan bases, these kids who have these really incredible personalities, and you've never heard of them, and you probably never will again. But all of a sudden, you know, like the Stetson Hatters are like the top of, like the only thing you want to talk about for 3 days.
FDU, Oral Roberts, all these schools, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And like that is what is so fun and unique about March Madness on the men's and women's side that like you don't really get in football. Football is objectively by the numbers a much more popular sport, it's a more lucrative sport. It's a sport that's controlling the entire college sports ecosystem. But, that's something that college football is trying to recreate, sort of like the magic, right? Like
I
the
think the problem with that is like with college football. First of all, you have to wait a more extended amount of time, so it's going to be
yeah.
harder to add more teams to the tournament. That's the first problem, and then the second, football is that one sport where like people always ask, can a college team beat a professional team? And in most cases, 99% of the time, it's no. It's always going to be that way for football, just because the competition difference for football between college and the NFL, or even just looking at college, FBS and FCS, or bigger FBS schools and smaller FBS schools, it's much larger and it's much more unlikely that there is going to be an upset, I feel, than basketball. I think football, again, you kind of have to weigh it out, right? You're going to make more money, but you're probably not going to have that same excitement as you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, March Madness is obviously incredible. I love watching it every year. We just mentioned the UConn Huskies. I am a UConn fan. It has been, to quote you, easy money over the past few years. It's been a dynasty. They're chasing a three-peat, something that has not been done since UCLA, even with all these incredible teams. And not only have they won 12 straight tournament games, they've done it all by double digits. They've completely annihilated everybody that's been in their way over these past 2 years. And it kind of came out of nowhere. They hadn't won a tournament game under Dan Hurley before this run, and now they've won 12 straight. What stood out to you from UConn and why they have been so dominant and so much better than everyone else these past few years?
I mean, look, I think there are folks who could probably speak to like the X's and O's better than I can, sort of like their strategy on the court. But like what sticks out to me is Dan Hurley's ability to recruit in the NIL and transfer portal era. His ability to put together a team that not only is cohesive, like literally you're re-recruiting your entire team every year
Yeah.
in this current landscape, right? So add to that, like you're re-recruiting and you have like younger guys, older guys, but they all have to sort of gel in one season. And then like he's had players who decide to stay, like there's a sense of longevity, there's a sense of loyalty to that program that he's building that I think is pretty rare. And like, yeah, it helps to win championships. Like for
right
that.
now it's even easier the pitch, right? You want to come by,
Right.
you're gonna be a first round NBA draft pick, win a championship. I mean, the pitch
Right.
is easy now, yeah.
Right. And then like the other thing I'll add is like Dan's like a psychopath, right? And like he's such a psychopath. And like I think there are a lot of people who talk about like his nature and how in his head he is and his superstitions and like all of his idiosyncrasies and the underwear and like, right? But like he's such a specific personality that if you as a player, like if you mesh with him from a recruiting standpoint, there's nobody else in all of the NCAA that's like him. So you know what I mean? Like there are a
Yeah.
lot of coaches that are like a dime a dozen in terms
He's
of
very
personality.
different. Yeah, he's different in the way
Yeah.
he
So
coaches
like
and the way he
that
recruits.
could
Yeah, 100%.
that could turn away a lot of kids, but the kids who mesh with him, they're gonna stay. They're
Yeah.
gonna be loyal. They're gonna like give
And
120.
they're gonna be great under his system.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I've actually met Dan multiple times, and it's funny, right? You mentioned like the whole psychopath, like crazy, and he is very passionate for those 40 minutes every single time UConn laces up. But then afterwards, he's just this chill guy. Like I met him at the UConn football game on the sidelines, and he's just there like with his hoodie on and stuff, and he's just like,
Yeah, he's
yeah,
cool.
it's very funny how like you could see two different sides of a coach. But 100%, I think being recruited by the Lakers for $100 million just says it all. I mean, Hurley is such an incredible coach. And then he adds on this recruiting aspect. And he is one of those coaches who has continued to thrive in this era. A lot of coaches, they don't want to do it. Coach K retired. That could be because of the NIL, Nick Saban and Jay Wright. A lot of people suspect that was because of this new era, NIL, the transfer portal, and all of these things where you essentially have to, as you mentioned, recruit your team year after year. Do you believe it is likely that coaches will continue to complain about this new style to the point where they're going to have to like change it up a little bit because it's been in favor of the players? They can switch teams basically every year at this point, but I think it makes the coach's job much harder. And I think Jay and Nick Saban would tell you that firsthand.
Yeah, it's funny. Like Tony Bennett, the Virginia head coach, literally like retired last
Before the season. Yeah.
literally like Thursday afternoon. They were like, "Hey, Tony Bennett's retiring." And we were like, "Excuse me?" I was like, "I have a feature to finish like tomorrow. Like I don't have time for this." But like I dropped everything and like covered his retirement press conference on Friday morning, and that's what he said. I mean, he made the decision like at the last second. He was like, "I can't do this anymore. NIL, transfer portal, it's a 24/7 job. It's unsustainable. I can't do this." And I think that there are coaches who probably feel that way. But I think the difference between Tony Bennett and like maybe some of the other coaches who like, have kind of stepped away is he made it very clear. He's like, I'm not against kids having these rights. I just think there needs to be a system like collective bargaining, for example, the way they do it in the pros. There needs to be a system where like it's civilized. Like we're not just like right, like where there are rules, like because unrestricted free agency like doesn't exist like anywhere, right? And I wrote today, and like I went to Big East Media Day speaking of Dan Hurley on Wednesday, and I was like talking to Rick Pitino, And I was like, Rick, like, what do you, someone asked, like, what do you think about Tony Bennett retiring? He, said all the nice things. And I said, well, Tony Bennett talked about like collective bargaining, which means athletes are employees, end of amateurism, NCAA, blah, blah. Like, what do you think about that? Like, as a solution to the problems that made him retire? He goes, well, I don't know why he retired. Why did he retire? I'm like, NIL in the transfer portal? He's like, well, I don't have a problem with NIL in the transfer portal. This is a really long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is like, Rick Pitino's in his 70s. He doesn't have a problem with NIL in the transfer portal. He's like, yeah, if anything, it makes it easier. Because, like, I know what the kids want. They want the money. They want the bag. So we negotiate. I don't go to their houses anymore. I don't sit with their parents and, like, talk about values. Like, nobody cares, right? Like, I know what they want. They know what they want. We figure it out. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So I actually think it's going to be the opposite. There are a lot more coaches who are going to be like, no, pay the kids. They're professionals. We treat them like professionals. And frankly, it might be easier for everybody if we just gave up what Gino Auriemma called literally 3 hours later after Patino a charade. He was like, amateurism is a charade. Doesn't mean he doesn't have problems with the system, doesn't want more rules and regulations. But he's like, we can move, we can make money. Why can't the kids?
Right. I do think there needs to be a little bit more structure to it. I mean, I currently know a player, and I was texting with him this morning, who went to a local school of mine last year, Fairfield University, right here. And he's on his fourth team in his senior year. And it's just like that, I do think is a very unsustainable way. But at the same time, you do have to think about there is a lot more talent out there. You mentioned the whole social media thing. There's a lot more way to get your talent out there and to get noticed. And so I do think there is an element of like, there's a lot of talent. The players need to be able to utilize where they want to use their talent properly. And I think they do need to find a balance. I think it may be chaotic. Maybe some coaches will love it. Maybe some coaches will hate it. I think it definitely is an interesting topic to just look at as a whole. Do you like it? I mean, we're talking about Patino. We're talking about Gino. We're talking about all these guys. What does Amanda Christovich think of it?
I mean, look, I'm supposed to be relatively objective, but I think the facts speak for themselves. I think the players generate $10 billion. I was reporting on television contracts over the last few years that, one conference is making $1 billion a year in a television contract. I mean, like, you can't pretend that this is not a business. You can't pretend that, the coaches and the players haven't been conducting themselves as if they're professionals for a long time. And I think the most important thing, it's like, whose opinion matters the most is not the coaches, it's not the NCAA, it's not the players, it's not me. It's federal labor law and the courts. Like, that's my take. Like, my take is like, we could talk all we want about what we think the players should be called. The reality in this country is like, we have laws that govern the economy and the labor market.
Right.
And a judge is going to decide whether or not these kids are professionals or not. It's not up to any of us. We're going to have to, right? Like, the only people who it could be up to are like Congress, because they want Congress to like pass a law that could like override a court decision. But like, other than that, so and to me, like, I believe that's the right thing. I believe that the courts should decide, because you look at this system and you say, okay, well, if you don't want the players to be considered employees, then don't treat them like employees. Then don't make $10 billion. Then don't pay your coach $9 million, right? Like, there are ways, like, literally just like, what the law is and how to treat a person to make
But at
them.
the same time, what are they going to do with that money? Is the university going to keep it? It's a tough choice. Yeah.
Well, but I mean, like, yeah, it's like, like, theoretically, you wouldn't be making that much money if it wasn't $1 billion business. But because you are, but the reason that they are making so much money is because they don't have to pay their labor force, which is something that has not existed in this country since slavery. So, I mean, like, people get really like upset when they hear that, but it's the truth. That is how this labor market is working. So from an economic standpoint, you wouldn't have $10 million to pay your coach if you had to also pay your players. But at the same time, if you don't want to treat them like employees, you don't want them to be employees, don't tell them what to eat. Don't tell them how much to weigh. Don't tell them how much water to drink. Don't tell them where to live. Don't tell them where to sleep. That's like the amount of like these players have more control exerted onto them as college athletes than like I do as a 27-year-old professional writer at Front Office Sports has over me. Front Office Sports doesn't tell me what to eat. The
Right.
closest they get to telling me what to eat is like every other Thursday they like order like lunch for the office. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and that's how you define who is and isn't an employee in this country. It's actually not about how much money you make. It's a system of control.
Yeah.
So don't control what the players do if you don't want them to be employees. It's like pretty simple.
Yeah, it's funny because you just mentioned this whole thing. A lot of people think it's just the NCAA and sports, but this is a whole like economic thing, and it all comes down to federal government stuff.
Mhm.
That's been the story I've been trying to get to. Is this story you recently wrote about how quote the future of college sports hangs in the balance with the 2024 elections, and you mentioned during this article, which I found so finally get its way or have a higher likelihood that that happens if Donald Trump beats Kamala Harris. I think it's crazy how like an election and the government could control so much of sports, and it's interesting that you agree with it because it is interesting how it is partially labor, but it is also sport. It's like it's a hard balance to find. I thought that article was interesting. Explain more about it, please, to the audience. Kind of how you came up with the idea, some of the research behind it.
Yeah, I mean, look, over the 4 years I've been covering this beat, I've become a political reporter, a business reporter covering multi-million-dollar corporations. I've become a legal reporter covering Supreme Court cases. Like, and one of the things I'm covering is like Congress getting involved in the future of college sports because the NCAA has realized the only way to save their current model and keep the athletes from being employees is to ask Congress to do so. Just trust me on that. I could explain all the legalese, but like it's like not worth it. Like just trust me. So that's the way. So I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh yeah, like it's not like there's any other consequential results that could come out of this election, like how the president or the makeup of Congress is gonna impact our lives in any other way. So obviously let's write about college sports. Okay, like of course, like a lot of people are not, that's not one of the 10 issues they're thinking about how their lives
Yeah.
could change based on the election. But like there are also a lot of people who are. So anyway, I was like, you know what? I'm going to call up the folks I know who work for, politicians, work for lawmakers in Congress. I know them because I've been covering hearings and legislation and all that stuff. And I called some experts, I called a lobbyist, and I was just like, hey, like, what are the odds the NCAA gets what it wants, which is a law that like calls the athletes amateurs forever, basically, right? Set that in stone. And they were like, well, the Republicans are more likely to do that. And so if the Republicans get the Senate, there's a committee. The committee would be head by Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is a guy he's a Texas guy. He really cares about college sports. He's made it very clear that college sports legislation is going to be a priority for him if he becomes the head of this committee, right? So there's like one thing. And then the other is like, yeah, the presidential race, like who's in the White House, that always like determines legislation in some form, even though the president obviously doesn't introduce legislation. College sports is like a weird issue though, where like if the president is like presented a bill that may be a little bit more conservative or liberal than the president themselves, they're probably not going to like quote waste like a veto on college sports legislation.
Yeah.
Like they're going to just, you know what I mean? So they're probably
Yeah.
going to sign it. But there are other like labor court appointments that they could make that could influence the judges making these decisions. You go on and on and on. So it was a really fun, interesting story to report. I have sort of some more political, like related stories that I'm going to be covering probably for a while. Because I think what a lot of people forget is like sports is a business. And how is a business regulated in this country? Through the economy and through legislation. And so if you're covering the team as a team, you're covering the team as a team. But if you're covering the team as a company, the league as a company, the conference as a company, it's a business. And so you have to be looking at, you know, how the rest of the country's institutions are going to affect it.
It is interesting how someone like me who would love to be a sports writer, it is important to be knowledgeable on different court cases, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Obviously, many cases about that in collegiate and professional sports. Now, in politics, it's just very interesting how you find that balance. Real quick before we wrap up, and I'll ask you about some of your kind of advice for future writers. I do want to ask you, Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese as well, but mainly Caitlin Clark helped make women's basketball, as you mentioned, basically just have just as much viewership as men's basketball, at least for last year's tournament. Now, with Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese having new homes in the WNBA, do you think the growth of women's basketball, of women's college basketball, will stay at that same pace with men's basketball now that those players have moved on?
Yeah, it's obviously the question we're all like sort of sitting like waiting with bated breath to figure out, right? Look, there's a new generation, and in some cases like a generation almost like older, like look at Paige Beckers, right? Like she kind of like fell out of the spotlight a little bit because of her injuries and
Yeah.
like came back, right? There's Kiki Rice, there's Paige Beckers, like there's AZ Fudd, like there is another generation of players that could sort of like occupy those spotlights and draw that, at least at close to the same amount of attention. And the secret is there always has been. There just hasn't been enough resources or visibility for those players to get their due. So I think that there will be a significant amount of viewership and excitement. I don't think it's going to slow down. I mean, look, the numbers fluctuate from year to year for like championships in every sport. So I can't say like it's going to go like, a straight line. But I do think that there was a breakthrough this past season and it's going to continue because like the players are cool and they're always going to be cool.
Yeah, I talked about with a UConn, the voice of UConn women's basketball, Bob Joyce, recently, and he was talking about how, and I was talking about with him, Paige did kind of fall off the spotlight. She was one of these main stars in women's basketball. Then she
Yeah.
gets hurt. These other stars step up. I'm curious to see what her AZ Fudd, that whole crew will do, and kind of who will occupy those spots, kind of in the fame for women's basketball, as you mentioned. Amanda, this has been amazing talking about college athletics with you, kind of about your career. For an aspiring writer listening to this, what would be your key piece of advice to give them to get to the point where you're at now?
I mean, look, a lot of it is luck and being at the right place at the right time. But it's like we've all heard about working hard, and obviously, like you're way far ahead of where I was. That's for sure. But I think like just follow what is interesting to you. Like one of the best pieces of advice I ever got from an editor was like, if you think something is interesting, like other people do too. So write about it, podcast about it. Like, when you're trying to figure out what you want to cover or even what you want to do, like if you find that you're doing something and it's really boring and you don't enjoy it, then like try not to do it. Like try something else, like a lot of the times like your gut instinct about what makes a story, what's interesting, what's cool, what's sketchy that you should be looking into as a journalist is like, or just any sort of like content creator,
Right.
you're probably right. Like just trust yourself and and use that as a starting point and go from there.
Amanda, thank you so much for coming on today, talking about all the great topics that we did and kind of the serious part of your job as well. We wish you the best of luck and we're looking forward to seeing your content. Audience, all of the links to Amanda's work is in the description if you want to check it out. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks again for coming on alongside Amanda Christovich of Front Office Sports. Thank you guys for watching. I'm your host, Chase Coburn. We will see you next time right here from the Cool Sports Network. Take care.